Hello everybody, hope you're doing marvelously well. We're back with another frequently asked questions. Apparently when I say FAQ Friday, it causes some consternation. Anyway, as ever, please subscribe, hit the notification bell. When we've been doing the live Q&As, we asked our audience a few days ago where they got notified best when we're going live. That makes sense? I don't know. I'll say it anyway. But most people said notification bell and email. So please sign up for the email list and you'll get a bunch of free drum samples. There's some free sessions, there's some free videos and all kinds of fun stuff. And you'll be notified of videos. And of course, if you hit that little notification bell down there, you'll also be notified when there's a new video. Would you recommend always using the same preamp on all drum mics? This is a bit of a quandary because I know the right answer, but then I also know that there are many exceptions. Okay, so what's the quote unquote right answer? Well, the right answer is that if you're in a really good room, like you can afford to go to a beautiful studio and they happen to have a console, like an API, which is great for drums, a Neve, a CADAC, I was just in the studio the other day of a Trident A range, something that has like 24, 16, 24, 40 channels of beautiful mic pre. There is nothing better, apparently, and in my opinion, than hearing all of those mics hitting at the same time. It just seems to sound fantastic. For me, the best drum sound I ever got in the Neve room at Conway, where they have the old Air Montserrat Neve console. All the mic pre's are 1081s and they're in the wall with a short mic run, like a very short mic cable run to the mics. And it was phenomenal. It was the best drum sound. When I asked Mark Ender in that recent interview, his favorite drum sound, guess where it was? At Conway, using the same console, everything. So that's the argument. And that's the argument I think most people will take, is that when you're using all the same pre's, all the drums are going to be hitting together. There's going to be no differences sonically between one pre and another, to be quite simple. Okay, so that's the right answer. The reason why the second part of this answer is a little contentious is because the most successful thing I've ever recorded was How to Save a Life, the drums on How to Save a Life. Those were done at my old studio using primarily a TAC Scorpion, which is a cheap AMEC console. You can get them from anywhere from about $2,000 down to about $750, whether like 8 channels, 16, 24, 40, whatever it is. The point is they're very inexpensive. For the price of one really nice Neve style BAE mic pre, for instance, you could buy the whole console. However, the only thing that went through that console was some of the room mics, because I had 2 pairs of stereos. I think I had one mono room mic as well, which actually went through a Joe Meek compressor, and a mic pre-compressor, one of those Joe Meek ones. Forgot the model name, VC something, or anyway, that. The overheads went through a pair of BAE 1272s. The kick in and out went through another pair of 1272s, and the snare top went through a BAE 1073. Then the hat, which was 2 different mics on a hat, summed together, went through the TAC Scorpion. We didn't have any toms, so there was no tom mics. I think probably the rooms all went through the TAC as well. The point is it was split up through an inexpensive console and some external mic pre's. And the only compression I was using was a DBX 160A, not the VU, the one with the red lights. That was the kick in. I had a 546, which is a Uri EQ, parametric EQ. I EQ'd the kick in with that, tightened the bottom end. I rolled off at high passed about 20 on the kick in. And then the EQ obviously on the 1073 on the snare. The point is it was spread all over the place. Oh, and 1176 on the snare. That was it. 2 compressors, the compressor mic pre for the mono drum mic, and everything else was a hodgepodge. I mean, it was just a hodgepodge of stuff. And that is still my favorite drum sound. If you go to Spotify, maybe there's a link flying around here somewhere, and listen to the drum sound on How to Save a Life. There's no reverb. All the ambience is the room mics. The room mics were a pair of 57s against the wall and a pair of really inexpensive Audix microphones behind the drummer. The point is, as you can see, a mixture of mic pre's, a mixture of quality of microphones with 57s and $400 Audix mics, a D112 inside the kick, a 609 on the outside, and a pair of 414s as overheads, 57 top and bottom on the snare, and a 57 and a pencil condenser taped together for the hi-hat, which was summed on the tack. That was the drum sound. The drum kit was a Rogers with a 22-inch kick. My pitted, crappy $75 Supraphonic, New Beat hi-hats, Peisty 2002, and some random cracked Sabian cymbal for a crash cymbal. That was it. It was a hodgepodge drum kit, hodgepodge collection of mic pre's in a good sounding room, don't get me wrong, with a great drummer, you know, Ben from The Fray. So yes, is the greatest drum sound I've ever got in Conway? Yeah, amazing. Mark Endert's best drum sound. Conway. What's the most successful thing I've ever recorded and a really cool drum sound? It's How to Save a Life. I mean, go listen to it. You'll hear the drum sound. It sounds really good. All the ambience from those 57s and those cheap Audix behind, and that mono mic. I believe the mono mic it might have been a Salt Shaker. It might have been before I got the Salt Shaker, because this is a long time ago. It's like 13 years ago. Either a cheap condenser or a cheap dynamic. It wasn't anything good. So there you go. That's kind of the proof. That's why when you hear me go creativity is king, that's when you hear me take a Lewitt mic or a Roswell mic or whatever mic it is and literally just record a song from scratch and use an Audient ID4 or the 1173 or whatever it is. I'm doing it because I know I have the proof, because I've made these records, that you don't need incredibly expensive gear to do it. I don't even think it was an HD system. I believe it was pre-HD, and it was probably, it was pre-HD. So it would have been on the, with 888s. So all of the wrong things, all of the things that people would tell you that didn't sound good. And it sounded great, and the song was a huge hit. So, right answer is, yes, go in and use a beautiful console. Second answer is whatever the heck you've got, whatever the quality of the equipment, it's all about the performance and most importantly, the song. So, my answer is long, but my honest answer is use whatever you've got and do the best job you can. What's the minimum number of mics you think you can get away with and still get a great drum sound? I think the answer to that question is, what are you recording? Are you recording a huge, massive metal record with tons and tons of guitars, which are like this massive wall of guitars, just this blob of square wave? Or are you recording a jazz band or a folk band, or even just like acoustic guitar, piano, stand-up bass and drums, or anywhere in between? Because that to me is what all of your decision making is made upon. We'll have a lot of debate on this. Now, obviously the Glyn Johns technique is very, very famous. And it is, you know, it's a mic over here over the floor side, one over here, one in the front, and there's tons of videos on it. I've done videos on it. There's a Matt Stark drum course about recording drums that we have. I'm sure that'll be flying around here as well. It's a great, great technique. And I love the way it sounds, especially if you're in a really big ambient room. It's fantastic because you pick up all the ambience and you get that bottom kind of big sound. You get the big kind of pillowy kind of woof kick. Yeah, it's fan-bleeding-tastic. But as much as I love Led Zeppelin, like all of us, they weren't Metallica guitars. They weren't just like raw. If they put those guitars into that drum mix, the energy would be sucked up and you wouldn't hear the energy of those drums. Hence why, you know, if you download my samples, there's the Black Album kick in there. And it is like massive. It is like EQ compressed and like created this like form. It is the biggest sounding kick you've ever heard in your life. You're not going to get that with 3 mics. That is a very heavily processed kick, and that's in the mix. When you listen to the Black Album, you hear this massive, massive kick. You also in the drums hear the most aggressive, like, you know, snare. And this is all fantastic stuff. My point is though, tune the snare, get the Tamar snare drum or the Noble and Cooley or anything, one of these massive metal explosive snare drums, and that will really, really help for that drum sound. But ultimately, the reason why you use more than 3 mics when you do is purely and simply because you want individual control. If you're in a situation where, you know, a drummer's playing a hat and a snare and you've got these 3 mics, whatever you turn up is going to favor maybe slightly more snare, but ultimately is going to pull up other things as well. Now, if you've got close mics, and it doesn't have to be 15, it could be just one kick, one snare. As soon as you're in that situation with a stereo pair of overheads, with a stereo pair of rooms, at least if you've got one kick and one snare, you suddenly have more control. And again, the same thing could be said for toms. How much definition do you want from the toms? If you listen to like the Queen stuff from the 70s and a lot of like Aerosmith records that Jack was making, they specifically, you know, individually mic'd the toms because those toms sat so far in front of the mix. It was like, people loved it in the 70s, those huge tom sounds. So you're not going to get that without individually miking. Now, it's arguable inside of a DAW that you could automate. If you only had 3 mics, of course you could automate kicks and snares and pull them out. You could automate drum fills. There's lots of things you can do, but you are creating a lot of extra work. So what's the secret? There is no one secret. It's what's the song for. But it could be individual kick mic, individual snare mic, pair of overheads, and you're done. You could do that. Then you're worried about tom work. Maybe the hi-hat's not favored enough. So then the next thing you do is you maybe add a hi-hat and 2 tom mics for a rack and a floor. That's pretty much going to get you a half decent drum sound. Kick, snare, hi-hat, 2 overheads, 2 toms. So you're suddenly into 7 mics. Here we'll do 8 mics because we'll do kick, snare top, snare bottom, hi-hat, overhead, overhead, tom, tom. So we typically do 8 mics on a drum kit. And then we'll maybe open up a 9th by taking the vocal mic and using it as a mono room. However, my room is tiny. So it doesn't really sound like a big room. It just sounds like a small bedroom with 1 mic picking up everything. And sometimes it can be more of a phase issue. However, if you get a decent mono drum sound, what you can then do is take that mono mix and put a reverb on it and create a summed mix of the drums in the room and put a reverb plugin on it. Nice little trick. So for me, I can do anything with the 3 mics, but it's a lot of work. But if I was to have a preference and you're setting up your first drum room, 8 mics would be nice if you wanted a mono room. 9 would be nice if you went and you did a stereo pair instead of a mono. And then the sky's the limit if you want to get a little crazier than that, if you want to double mic your kick drum and all this kind of stuff. But I think you're typically talking like 8 or 9, which is good because, you know, a lot of manufacturers, one of the next step up in their interfaces is 8 inputs. So I think once you're into that 8 input world, you're covering all the bases. Now, don't get me wrong. I've done many, many drum sessions with 1 mic, hence the Lewitt video of last week. The Roswell video, the 2 weeks before that, we've done many, many 1 mic sessions. We've also done 3 mic sessions, 4 and 5. All of these things are combinations, but for me to get the best, really to get the best amount of control, I'm going to go with 8 as my answer, possibly 9 for a stereo room. Any tips for recording drums in a bad room? I think I've sort of answered that in the first and second question, especially the second question. If your room is bad, i.e. it's not big, it doesn't sound good, it's got tons of reflections, you may or may not want to do room mics. If it's got tons of reflections, that's not actually necessarily bad for room mics. It just depends on what it's doing. If it's overly bright, there's tons of glass, then put blankets, get rid of that glass, because every time you hit a cymbal, it's going to literally take your head off. So you want to be dampening. When you mean bad room, it's such a wide definition of things. I think if it's a very small bedroom, then you literally stick with close mics, and then you make a blend of your close mics and send that to a reverb, and then you can add some ambience that way, maybe favoring the snare, thinking that kind of way. If you wanted to use a snare or kick sample, you can use the snare sample, for instance, and trigger the reverb that way, so you don't get all the bleed of the other mics. A bad room is really kind of an interesting discussion. One person's bad room is another person's amazing. A small dead room, a tiny small dead room, is incredible for certain drum sounds. A big live room is amazing for certain drum sounds, but if it's overly bright, then you're going to want to dampen it. Maybe you're going to want to baffle either side. So we used to take like big mic stands, put them into a T configuration, then hang packing blankets over them and bring them either side, and any blanket, bring them either side of the drums just to control the overheads. Most of it's common sense. When it comes to high frequencies, you just want to be dampening it. And with drums, to be honest, that's always the biggest problem, is excessive high frequencies. It's drummers playing the kick and snare politely, kick, snare, to kick, kick, snare, you know, tapping the toms and then smashing a cymbal as though they were trying to kill it, you know. and then that cymbal's decaying over the kick and the snare, and the room mics are just destroyed. Drum rooms and drum kits and drum recordings are more defined by the drummer than anything else. Drumming, in my perspective, and to be honest, in my experience, is one of the biggest differences. If I take my amp and overload it massively, most people sound pretty much the same playing an A chord on it. With a few exceptions, it's the same sound. Yes, there are variations, don't get me wrong. But if I sit you down on a drum kit, which has been tuned for Kenny Aronoff, for a guy that slams and can play so hard, and I sit behind it, it doesn't sound like a very good drum kit. And it sounds totally different, not a bit different. So drums are a big deal. You know, getting that tuning and that kit right and that miking. Do not underestimate what a drummer brings. Your best drum recordings are going to be from your best drummers. Why do skilled recording engineers, producers send songs to other mixers to finish off? Well, that's an interesting discussion. There's sort of two answers to that. As a producer and an engineer, quite often my material, the label is making that choice. Maybe they want Serban to mix the single or something like this. They're making that choice to do it, which is fine. You know, they want a single, they want a radio-ready mix, they'll do that. So often it's not the choice of the producer or the engineer. However, it can be the choice of the producer and engineer. We just recently interviewed Andrew Wells, and he's a young up-and-coming producer. He did Jason Mraz, 5 Seconds of Summer, and Meghan Trainor. So he's done these great records. The Jason Mraz record is very organic. And he's not mixing it, and he's at a point where he's young and he's up and coming and he's working really, really hard, that he wants to work with an experienced mixer and learn from it. And also he wants somebody else to mix it so he can carry on producing and engineering. I got to a point a few years ago, especially after the success of a few bands I worked with, where I got so busy that I was happy to give Mark Needham and Tim Palmer, those guys, a lot of my mixes. And then when I was doing some other bigger label stuff, you know, and they would pay for it as well, we could use those guys. And we started bringing, you know, obviously Mark Ender, Spike Stent. So I got to use all of these incredible mixers, these 4 or 5, Michael Brower, you know, these guys mix my stuff. And it was actually a blessing, because I could move from one project to another, and I could go into the room and hang out with Michael Brower for 2 to 3 days and finish up a Frey record or a Mandy Perkins record or a Josiah Lemming record. Those are records I did with him. It was a great experience, and I learned a lot from being in a room with him. So sometimes it's not out of choice, it's the label's choice. And then secondly, it is out of choice because you want to learn something and you're too busy and you want to concentrate on one skill. Now, we recently interviewed Eric Valentine, who's in the reverse situation. He's starting now to do a lot of mixing. He's always has, but now he's starting to predominantly mix. And as he said in that interview, he doesn't see himself going back to producing albums for 3 to 6 to 9 months anymore. He's like, he doesn't imagine those 12, 15-hour days anymore. And, you know, now that he's married with kids or a kid, you know, it changes his perspective on how many hours he wants to work and how much he wants to lose from his family. The point is like there's lots of reasons to either be a mixer or not mix. And a lot of the time they're stylistic, and then a lot of the time they're out of necessity because you're really, really busy. How do you go about processing/compressing a snare with lots of ghost notes to make it cut through the mix and keep its dynamic range? Firstly, I would have to examine what was going on. If there's a 4 on the floor, that's always a pain in the butt, because 4 on the floors, the kick and the snare are playing at the same time. But that's not very often. So on a normal kind of drum part where it's like and I'm doing all this kind of ghost stuff and I want to pick it up, one of the tricks I really, really like is really obvious. Duplicate the snare track, compress it really, really hard so everything is equally as loud. So every snare drum hit that goes groink, those ghost notes are like from a now those ghost notes have come right up. It's a good place to start from. So now we're in a position where the ghost notes are significantly louder. However, as you're probably starting to think, the kick drum beat's super loud. And also maybe you don't like the sound of those snare hits. I think the single snare hits will be okay, but the kick drum beating, not so good. So what do I do? Well, first of all, you can take that parallel compressed snare and bring it up underneath. Is the kick drum bothering you? Aha. Now you could gate. I wouldn't gate. What I would do is after that squash compressor, is I'd apply another compressor. I would take something like a Renaissance compressor, an R-comp, and stick that afterwards because it's got a fast enough attack and release, and then sidechain it from the kick. So now every time the kick plays, it compresses. So instead of going kicker, the kick will now duck every single time it plays. So sidechain compress. So first of all, compress a duplicated track of your snare drum so you hear all of those ghost notes where you want to hear them. Then run a compressor afterwards, which is sidechain from the kick to compress every time the kick hits. And then you'll get a track which is predominantly ghost notes that you can just bring up underneath your main snare track, and Bob's your uncle. It will sound fantastic. Thank you ever so much for watching. Wonderful questions, really amazing. Please leave a bunch of comments and questions below. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notifications bell. Don't forget to check out some of our other videos and have a marvelous time recording and mixing. Oh, download the Lewitt Audio single mic one. That is a really good video, and it will show you and teach you about drum balance. Watch Matt Starr play in that video and then just listen to that single mono mic. See you later.